Hey guys, tonight we begin with what it was like to be the village's most misunderstood resident, the woman everyone thought was a witch, but who was actually just really bad at normal medieval life. Imagine being so spectacularly incompetent at basic 1600 survival that your neighbors genuinely believed you'd made a deal with Satan himself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease tonight's journey together into the hilariously tragic world of medieval miscommunication and accidentally convincing your entire village that you're in league with dark forces. Let's start with the biggest misconception about being accused of witchcraft in 1600s England. Most people think it was all about dramatic trials, burning stakes, and obvious witchy behavior. In reality, you could become the village witch simply by being terrible at churning butter, having a cat that was slightly too black, or, and this is completely true, sneezing at the wrong moment during Sunday service. This wasn't some grand conspiracy of evil magic. It was more like medieval, suburbia's version of that neighbor who somehow always burns dinner and whose garden gnomes seem to multiply overnight. Your fellow villagers weren't dealing with some mystical sorceress brewing love potions. They were trying to figure out why Margaret's chickens kept dying, why her bread never rose properly, and why strange smells kept emanating from her cottage at odd hours. Spoiler alert, it was usually just really bad cooking. The 1600s in rural England wasn't exactly what you'd call a golden age of scientific reasoning. Your average English village wasn't a quaint postcard scene with rosy-cheeked farmers merrily tending their perfect gardens. It was more like a collection of suspicious neighbors, all desperately trying to survive while secretly convinced that everyone else was probably up to something sinister. The local church controlled not just spiritual matters, but basically functioned as the medieval equivalent of a homeowners association. Except instead of complaining about your lawn height, they were monitoring your soul's proximity to eternal damnation. If you thought medieval people were charmingly superstitious, think again. They were paranoid, poorly fed, and had absolutely no understanding of basic cause and effect. When someone's cow gave sour milk, it clearly wasn't because of poor hygiene or diet. It was obviously because someone with suspicious eyebrows had walked past the barn while muttering under their breath. The village magistrate, typically the most educated person around, had maybe learned to read Latin prayers and could count to 50 on a good day. These were the people deciding whether your tendency to talk to yourself while doing chores was evidence of demonic consultation. And let's be honest about rural English weather. It was miserable, unpredictable, and seemed personally designed to make everyone's life harder. When crops failed, animals died, or someone got sick, the villagers needed an explanation that didn't involve admitting that sometimes life just sucks for no reason. Enter the convenient scapegoat, that weird woman down the lane who keeps to herself has an unusual number of cats and somehow always knows when it's going to rain. Clearly, she's made arrangements with supernatural forces. Meet Eleanor Blackthorne, and yes, that was unfortunately her actual surname, inherited from a grandfather who'd been a perfectly respectable blacksmith but whose unfortunate last name would later contribute to her mystical reputation. Eleanor wasn't a witch. She was just spectacularly unlucky and possessed what we might charitably call alternative domestic skills. But Eleanor had a gift for accidentally appearing witchy in the most innocent situations possible. Take her garden, for instance. While her neighbors grew neat rows of vegetables, Eleanor's plot looked like nature's own abstract art project. Her carrots grew in mysterious spirals. Her herbs seemed to arrange themselves in patterns that definitely weren't intentional. and her flowers bloomed in colors that shouldn't have existed in nature, but somehow did. The truth? Eleanor was colorblind, and had been randomly planting seeds she couldn't properly identify. She thought she was growing normal vegetables. Instead, she created what looked like a botanical tribute to otherworldly forces. Then, there was the matter of her cooking. Eleanor's stews were legendary, not because they tasted good, but because they seemed to violate several laws of physics. Ingredients would mysteriously multiply, change color, or occasionally develop what appeared to be sentience. Her neighbors would peek over the fence and see her stirring a pot that was simultaneously smoking, bubbling, and somehow glowing faintly in the afternoon sunlight. She was just trying to make dinner. They were witnessing what looked like advanced alchemy. And if you think that's suspicious, wait until you hear about the time Eleanor tried to cure her own headache with what she thought was a harmless herbal remedy and ended up accidentally dyeing her hair green for 3 months. Try explaining that to suspicious neighbors in an era when unusual hair color was considered a sure sign of demonic influence. This wasn't just about village gossip or social awkwardness. Being labeled a witch in 1600s England was like being added to a very dangerous neighborhood watch list where the penalties ranged from social exile to actual execution. The English legal system had recently become obsessed with rooting out witchcraft, and local magistrates were under pressure to prove their communities were properly godly and witch-free. Eleanor's situation was particularly precarious because she was a widow living alone, already suspicious in a society that believed women needed constant male supervision to avoid falling into temptation. Her modest inheritance gave her just enough independence to live without remarrying, which made her neighbors uncomfortable. A woman who could survive on her own was either remarkably virtuous or had clearly made some kind of deal with supernatural forces. Given Eleanor's track record of accidentally seeming supernatural, the village was leaning heavily toward the latter explanation. The stakes were real. Accusation could lead to imprisonment, trial, property confiscation, and death. What made Eleanor's situation tragically comedic was that she was completely unaware that her reputation was evolving from odd to mystically dangerous. She thought people were just being friendly when they started crossing themselves after talking to her. But Eleanor's accidental witchiness was just the beginning of a much larger comedy of errors. The village had a magistrate who was determined to prove his competence by catching a real witch, and Eleanor's reputation was about to collide with his ambitions in ways that nobody could have predicted. Eleanor's talent for accidentally appearing supernatural wasn't just bad luck, it was a perfect storm of medieval misconceptions meeting one woman's spectacular inability to blend in. Unlike your typical village woman who kept her head down, followed established routines, and tried desperately not to stand out, Eleanor had an almost supernatural gift for doing everything in ways that looked deliberately mysterious to her neighbors. The thing about 1600s village life was that it operated on patterns that had been established for centuries. You woke at dawn. You did your chores in a specific order. You spoke to your neighbors in prescribed ways. And you definitely didn't deviate from these norms unless you wanted people to start asking uncomfortable questions about your spiritual allegiances. Eleanor, through no fault of her own, managed to violate these social contracts on an almost daily basis. Part of the problem was that Eleanor had been raised in a slightly more prosperous household before marrying into village life. Her father had been a merchant who traveled to larger towns, so she'd grown up with access to books, different ideas about medicine, and what we might call foreign concepts, like the radical notion that maybe you didn't have to accept every illness as God's will. When she tried to apply this relatively sophisticated knowledge in a village where the height of medical expertise was pray harder and maybe try bleeding, she looked like someone with access to forbidden knowledge. But the real issue was Eleanor's personality. She was curious, which was dangerous. She asked questions, which was suspicious. She experimented with new ways of doing things, which was practically evidence of demonic consultation. In a community where the safest approach was to do exactly what your grandmother had done, and her grandmother before her, Eleanor's tendency to think, "What if I tried this differently?" marked her as someone who clearly had guidance from otherworldly sources. The irony, of course, was that Eleanor's mysterious behavior was usually just the result of her trying to solve perfectly normal problems through logical thinking. An approach that was so foreign to her neighbors that it might as well have been actual witchcraft. When everyone else accepted that certain problems were unsolvable mysteries at divine will, Eleanor's stubborn insistence on finding practical solutions made her look like someone who had definitely made a deal with dark forces. Take Eleanor's approach to laundry, which became the stuff of village legend. While other women spent entire days scrubbing clothes against rocks in the freezing river, Eleanor had observed that certain plants seemed to create natural soap-like substances when crushed. Through careful experimentation, which looked suspiciously like someone mixing mysterious potions, she developed what was essentially a primitive detergent that actually worked better than traditional methods. Her neighbors would watch in fascination and horror as Eleanor would gather specific plants at dawn, clearly the optimal time for harvesting magical ingredients, crush them in her mortar and pestle while muttering to herself, actually just thinking through the process out loud, and create a bubbling mixture that would somehow clean clothes better than hours of back-breaking scrubbing. The fact that she'd figured out basic chemistry through trial and error didn't matter. What mattered was that she was achieving impossible results through processes that looked exactly like what they imagined witchcraft would involve. One village woman allegedly told the magistrate that she'd seen Eleanor consulting with invisible forces while doing laundry, which was actually just Eleanor talking herself through the recipe she was still perfecting. Another claimed that Eleanor's washing water glowed with unnatural light, which was the result of Eleanor adding certain plant oils that created an iridescent film on the water's surface. Pretty, but definitely not supernatural. The situation got worse when Eleanor tried to help. When young Mary Wickham came down with a fever that wouldn't break, Eleanor offered a remedy she'd learned from her merchant father. A simple tea made from willow bark that actually contained natural pain relievers. Within 2 days, Mary was back on her feet, which should have been good news. Instead, it became evidence that Eleanor had supernatural healing powers. The recovery was so dramatic that people started whispering about whether Eleanor had bargained with dark forces for Mary's life and what the hidden cost might be. When Mary's family pig died 3 weeks later, from completely unrelated causes involving the pig's tendency to eat anything that wasn't nailed down, the village decided this was obviously the price Eleanor had extracted for her magical intervention. Things escalated when Eleanor tried to prevent Thomas Fletcher's barn from burning down. She'd noticed that his hay storage was creating dangerous conditions, and tried to warn him using knowledge she'd gained from growing up around her father's merchant warehouses. When Thomas ignored her advice and his barn promptly caught fire, exactly as she'd predicted, Eleanor's reputation evolved from suspiciously knowledgeable to definitely has prophetic abilities. The fact that Eleanor had made her prediction based on observable evidence, the hay was stored incorrectly, the weather was unusually dry, and Thomas had a habit of being careless with his lantern, didn't matter to her neighbors. What mattered was that she'd known something bad would happen before it happened, which was clearly evidence of supernatural foresight. Eleanor's attempts to explain her reasoning only made things worse. When she tried to describe how she'd noticed the warning signs, her neighbors heard someone revealing knowledge that should have been impossible for a normal person to possess. Her logical explanation sounded suspiciously like someone trying to cover up their actual methods of supernatural consultation. But it wasn't that simple, because Eleanor's growing reputation created a feedback loop that made everything more complicated. As people became convinced she had magical abilities, they started interpreting everything she did through that lens, which meant that perfectly normal behavior started looking supernatural simply because Eleanor was the one doing it. When Eleanor worked in her garden early in the morning, it wasn't because she discovered that plants absorb water better in the cool morning air. It was because dawn was clearly the optimal time for gathering magical ingredients. When she kept cats for practical reasons like pest control, they weren't just cats. They were obviously her familiar spirits. When she knew things about weather patterns from years of careful observation, she wasn't demonstrating practical knowledge. She was revealing her ability to commune with natural forces. The contradictions in the village's logic would have been funny if they weren't so dangerous. They simultaneously believed Eleanor was powerful enough to control supernatural forces, and yet somehow too incompetent to use these powers consistently. They thought she could curse their crops, but somehow couldn't figure out how to grow her own vegetables in straight lines. They believed she could see the future, but apparently hadn't foreseen her own reputation problems. Even more contradictory was their relationship with Eleanor's supposed abilities. The same people who crossed themselves when they saw her would secretly approach her when they needed help with problems their conventional methods couldn't solve. They feared her supernatural knowledge, but couldn't resist consulting it when their children were sick or their crops were failing. Eleanor herself was caught in an impossible situation. If she tried to downplay her abilities, people assumed she was being modest about her powers or trying to avoid detection by church authorities. If she helped people successfully, it proved she had supernatural abilities. If she failed to help, it meant she was either holding back her true power or it angered whatever dark forces she'd supposedly allied with. The village had created a perfect, logical trap where everything Eleanor did could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft, and there was literally no way for her to behave that wouldn't somehow reinforce their suspicions. The result was that Eleanor found herself living in an increasingly surreal version of her own life. Conversations with neighbors became exercises in careful interpretation. Was Martha asking about her herb garden because she was genuinely interested in gardening, or because she was trying to gather intelligence about Eleanor's supernatural practices? When children ran away from her cottage, were they playing normal games, or had their parents specifically warned them about the dangerous witch woman? Eleanor's social isolation grew more pronounced as people became genuinely afraid to associate with her too closely. The village women who had once included her in their daily routines now treated interactions with her like diplomatic missions, brief, formal, and carefully witnessed by other people. Nobody wanted to be seen as Eleanor's friend, because friendship with a suspected witch could easily make you a suspect yourself. The economic consequences were equally problematic. Eleanor's small income from her late husband's property remained steady, but the informal economy of village life, the trading of services, sharing of resources, and mutual aid that kept everyone surviving, gradually excluded her. People stopped asking for her help with tasks she was actually good at, but paradoxically started approaching her for problems they thought required supernatural intervention. This created the bizarre situation where Eleanor was simultaneously socially isolated and secretly in high demand. Women would sneak to her cottage after dark to ask for help with fertility problems, sick animals, or family disputes, not because they trusted her judgment, but because they believed she had magical solutions to problems that conventional wisdom couldn't address. Church attendance became a weekly exercise in social theater, with Eleanor trying to demonstrate her piety while the rest of the congregation monitored her behavior for signs of supernatural allegiances. Did she pray too quietly? Was she muttering incantations? Did she seem too comfortable with the prayers against witchcraft? Every Sunday became a performance where Eleanor tried to appear devoutly normal, while her neighbors searched for evidence of her hidden supernatural nature. Perhaps most frustrating for Eleanor was that her genuine attempts to be helpful were consistently interpreted as evidence of dark powers. When she brought soup to sick neighbors, they wondered what magical ingredients she'd added. When she offered practical advice, they assumed she was revealing supernatural knowledge. Her basic human kindness had become suspicious, simply because people expected a witch to have ulterior motives for everything she did. Meanwhile, the village magistrate, Thomas Grimsby, was beginning to take notice of Eleanor's reputation. Grimsby had recently been appointed to his position and was eager to prove himself as a competent authority figure capable of maintaining proper Christian order in his jurisdiction. He'd heard whispers about the unusual woman who seemed to know things she shouldn't know and could do things that defied normal explanation. What made Grimsby's interest particularly dangerous was that he was exactly the kind of official who believed that demonstrating his effectiveness meant finding actual threats to investigate. A magistrate who never uncovered any wrongdoing might appear incompetent to his superiors, but a magistrate who successfully identified and dealt with supernatural threats would be seen as vigilant and capable. Eleanor's growing reputation was beginning to attract attention beyond the village gossip network, and Grimsby was starting to wonder whether the stories he'd been hearing might represent a real problem that required official intervention. The informal suspicions of Eleanor's neighbors were about to collide with the formal legal system's mechanisms for dealing with suspected witchcraft, and Eleanor was completely unaware that her life was about to become significantly more complicated than just dealing with suspicious neighbors and awkward social interactions. If Eleanor's accidental witchcraft was a comedy of errors, then Magistrate Thomas Grimsby's investigation was a masterclass in how good intentions and bureaucratic ambition could turn a misunderstanding into a full-blown legal disaster. Unlike the village gossips who were content to whisper suspicions over their morning ale, Grimsby approached the Eleanor situation with all the systematic thoroughness of a man determined to prove he was taking his job seriously. Grimsby wasn't some corrupt official looking to persecute innocent people. He was actually trying to be fair and methodical, which somehow made everything infinitely worse. He'd received his appointment through a combination of basic literacy, family connections, and what his superiors mistook for wisdom, but was actually just chronic indecisiveness disguised as careful deliberation. Grimsby genuinely believed that proper investigation would either clear Eleanor's name or reveal the truth about her supernatural activities, because he lived in a world where truth was always discoverable through correct procedures. The problem was that Grimsby's idea of proper investigation techniques had been shaped by legal manuals that treated witchcraft as a real phenomenon that could be detected through careful observation and logical analysis. He wasn't approaching this as let's see if Eleanor is actually a witch. He was approaching it as let's use established methods to determine the extent and nature of Eleanor's supernatural activities. The possibility that there might be nothing supernatural to investigate simply wasn't in his conceptual framework. What made Grimsby particularly dangerous was his combination of genuine concern for justice and complete ignorance about how normal life worked for people outside his social class. He'd never had to grow his own food, make his own medicine, or solve practical problems without access to servants and resources. Eleanor's basic survival skills looked like arcane knowledge to someone who'd never had to learn them. Grimsby's investigation was about to demonstrate how the legal system's attempt to be thorough and fair could systematically transform innocent behavior into criminal evidence. Every methodology he used to prove Eleanor's innocence was designed in ways that would actually reinforce suspicions about her supernatural activities, because the entire framework assumed that witchcraft was real and detectable rather than considering The possibility that people might just be really, really wrong about what they thought they were seeing. Consider Grimsby's first official action, a comprehensive interview with Eleanor to get her side of the story. This seemed reasonable. Obviously, an accused person should have the opportunity to explain themselves. What Grimsby didn't understand was that he was essentially asking Eleanor to prove a negative while using questions designed to catch supernatural practitioners in lies. The interview took place in Grimsby's official chamber, with Eleanor seated across from a man who represented the power of life and death over her future, answering questions that had no safe answers. When Grimsby asked how she'd learned her herbal remedies, Eleanor tried to explain about her father's merchant connections and the things she'd learned from traveling healers. To Grimsby, this sounded like someone admitting to studying forbidden knowledge from suspicious sources. Exactly what he'd expect a witch to say if she were trying to conceal the supernatural origin of her abilities. When he asked about her unusual success with healing and predicting problems, Eleanor attempted to describe her methods of observation and logical reasoning. But Grimsby's legal training had taught him that witches often tried to disguise their supernatural powers as natural abilities. So Eleanor's explanation sounded precisely like the kind of cover story a clever witch would create. Her intelligence worked against her. Someone genuinely innocent would presumably give simpler, less sophisticated explanations. The questioning became surreal when Grimsby tried to determine whether Eleanor had ever communicated with supernatural entities. Eleanor truthfully answered that she sometimes talked to herself while working, thinking through problems out loud. Grimsby carefully recorded this as admits to regular conversations with unseen entities while performing suspicious activities. When Eleanor mentioned that she sometimes felt like her deceased husband was still looking out for her, a perfectly normal expression of grief, Grimsby noted, claims ongoing relationship with spirits of the dead. Grimsby's investigation expanded to include formal interviews with Eleanor's neighbors, which transformed village gossip into official testimony. Martha Wickham, who'd been telling anyone who'd listened that Eleanor's laundry methods were unnaturally effective, suddenly found herself giving sworn statements about witnessing the accused perform inexplicable transformations using mysterious substances and incantations. The big incident became a central piece of evidence when Thomas Fletcher testified that Eleanor had prophesied the destruction of my livestock with supernatural accuracy. The fact that Thomas was still bitter about ignoring Eleanor's practical advice didn't come up during questioning. Grimsby was focused on documenting the supernatural prediction, not analyzing whether it might have been based on observable evidence. Perhaps most damaging was Grimsby's interview with young Mary Wickham, whose fever Eleanor had helped cure. Mary, terrified of being questioned by an official and desperate to avoid any suggestion that she might have been involved in supernatural activities, described Eleanor's healing methods in terms that made them sound as mysterious and otherworldly as possible. Mary's attempt to protect herself by emphasizing how strange Eleanor's remedies had seemed turned a simple case of effective herbal medicine into testimony about supernatural healing powers. Grimsby meticulously documented each piece of evidence, creating an official record that transformed Eleanor's life into what looked like a comprehensive case study of witchcraft activities. Her garden became a collection of plants arranged in patterns suggesting supernatural significance. Her cats became multiple familiar spirits maintained for unknown purposes. Her tendency to work at unusual hours became regular performance of activities during times associated with supernatural practices. The investigation's most absurd moment came when Grimsby decided to test Eleanor's supernatural knowledge by asking her to predict the weather. Eleanor, who'd been observing weather patterns for years out of practical necessity, accurately predicted that the next day would be rainy based on obvious signs like wind direction and cloud formation. Grimsby recorded this as demonstrated, prophetic abilities during controlled testing, apparently unaware that weather prediction was a survival skill rather than supernatural power. This wasn't an isolated case of bureaucratic incompetence. It was part of a larger pattern of how the English legal system approached witchcraft accusations during this period. Magistrates across the country were using similar investigative methods, all designed around the assumption that witchcraft was real and that proper procedures could reliably identify supernatural practitioners. The pattern was always the same. Take behaviors that were unusual but perfectly explainable. Apply investigative frameworks designed to detect supernatural activity and systematically interpret all evidence through the lens of confirming rather than questioning the original. Suspicions. Other cases from the same period show women being convicted for having too many cats, growing unusually successful gardens, being knowledgeable about herbal medicine, or simply being widowed and financially independent. Why this pattern existed was partly about social control and partly about genuine fear. The legal system was trying to maintain order in communities that were genuinely terrified of supernatural threats they believed were real. Magistrates like Grimsby weren't cynically manufacturing evidence. They were conscientiously applying methods they'd been taught would reveal truth, not understanding that their methods were fundamentally flawed. The social factors were equally important. Accusations typically targeted women who somehow deviated from expected norms. Too independent, too knowledgeable, too successful, or too different. Eleanor represented multiple threats to social order. She was economically independent, intellectually curious, and competent in ways that challenged assumptions about what normal women should be able to accomplish. The pattern also reveals how communities dealt with unexplained problems by finding individual scapegoats rather than examining systemic issues. Instead of acknowledging that life in 1600s England was difficult and unpredictable for reasons nobody fully understood, it was psychologically easier to believe that mysterious problems had mysterious causes that could be eliminated by removing the right person. Comparison to other time periods shows that this pattern isn't unique to medieval witch hunts. It's a recurring human tendency to use systematic methods to confirm biases rather than challenge them. The specific supernatural beliefs were cultural products of their time, but the underlying psychological and social dynamics appear whenever communities feel threatened by people who don't conform to expected patterns. The effects of Grimsby's thorough investigation were exactly the opposite of what he'd intended to accomplish. Instead of resolving the community's concerns about Eleanor through fair and systematic examination of the evidence, his official involvement transformed local gossip into legal proceedings that made Eleanor's situation infinitely more dangerous. Eleanor went from being the village's eccentric neighbor to being the subject of formal witchcraft investigation, which changed how everyone interacted with her. People who had been merely suspicious became genuinely afraid. If the magistrate was taking Eleanor's case seriously enough to conduct official interviews, then maybe the supernatural threat was real and immediate. Eleanor's social isolation became complete as people stopped even the minimal interactions they'd maintained before. The investigation also created what we might call evidence creep. Each interview generated new details that, when officially recorded, became additional pieces of evidence supporting the witchcraft theory. Village stories that had been vague and contradictory became specific and consistent when filtered through Grimsby's systematic questioning. The investigation didn't just document existing suspicions. It actively created more convincing evidence by imposing official structure on informal gossip. For Grimsby personally, the investigation was successful in ways that guaranteed Eleanor's problems would continue escalating. His superiors were impressed by his thoroughness and the substantial documentation he'd compiled. The fact that his investigation had uncovered what appeared to be a clear case of supernatural activity demonstrated his competence and vigilance. Grimsby's career prospects improved significantly, which gave him strong incentives to continue pursuing the case rather than questioning his methods. The broader community effects were equally problematic. Grimsby's investigation established a precedent for how supernatural suspicion should be handled, encouraging other communities to pursue similar systematic approaches to identifying witches. Eleanor's case became a model for how proper legal procedures could successfully detect and document supernatural threats. Most tragically, the investigation created momentum that would be nearly impossible to reverse. Once official legal proceedings had been initiated and substantial evidence compiled, admitting that the entire case might be based on misunderstandings would require acknowledging that the legal system itself was fundamentally flawed. It was much easier to continue pursuing the case to its logical conclusion than to question whether the whole framework might be wrong. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of how serious her situation had become. She knew the magistrate had been asking questions, but she'd answered honestly and assumed that honesty would clear up any misunderstandings. She didn't understand that her honest answers had been systematically interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity, or that Grimsby's investigation had transformed her from a subject of village gossip into a formal legal case that was gaining momentum within the official justice system. Yet even as Grimsby was building his case through careful documentation and systematic interviews, Eleanor was unwittingly providing him with even more compelling evidence through her daily attempts to live a normal life. Every effort she made to demonstrate her innocence somehow reinforced the growing conviction that she was hiding supernatural abilities. The investigation had reached the point where Eleanor's behavior was being monitored and interpreted by people who were convinced they were observing a dangerous supernatural practitioner trying to conceal her true nature. Her attempts to appear normal looked like calculated deception. Her helpfulness seemed like attempts to manipulate people through supernatural influence, and her knowledge appeared to be evidence of forbidden learning. What Eleanor didn't realize was that her case had attracted attention beyond just Magistrate Grimsby and the local village. Word of the thorough investigation and the compelling evidence it had uncovered was beginning to spread to other officials who specialized in witchcraft cases. Eleanor's situation was about to escalate from a local legal matter to a regional case that would involve people with much more experience in prosecuting supernatural crimes and much less interest in considering alternative explanations for the evidence that had been so carefully compiled. By the autumn of 1634, Eleanor's situation had reached a breaking point that nobody, least of all Eleanor herself, had seen coming. What had started as village gossip about an eccentric neighbor had evolved into a formal legal case that was attracting attention from regional authorities who specialized in supernatural crimes. The problem was that everyone involved in escalating Eleanor's case had been acting with what they considered the best of intentions, which had created a perfect storm of bureaucratic momentum that was now virtually impossible to stop. Magistrate Grimsby's thorough documentation had impressed his superiors so much that they decided Eleanor's case warranted consultation with Judge William Thornfield, a regional authority who had built his reputation on successfully prosecuting witchcraft cases across 3 counties. Thornfield wasn't some sadistic witch hunter. He was considered a fair and methodical legal expert who brought scientific rigor to the challenging task of identifying supernatural crimes. The fact that his scientific rigor was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about how witchcraft worked didn't diminish his reputation as someone who could reliably separate genuine supernatural threats from false accusations. Eleanor remained blissfully unaware that her case had attracted this level of official attention. She knew that Magistrate Grimsby had been asking questions around the village, and she'd heard rumors that some of her neighbors had been interviewed about her activities, but she assumed this was just Grimsby being thorough about investigating. the silly rumors that had been circulating. Eleanor genuinely believed that anyone who examined the facts objectively would quickly realize that she was just a normal woman who happened to be good at practical problem solving. The stakes involved were becoming terrifyingly real. Judge Thornfield's involvement meant that Eleanor's case would be handled according to regional legal standards for witchcraft prosecution, which included procedures like formal examination for supernatural marks, testing for supernatural abilities, and the possibility of enhanced interrogation techniques designed to overcome supernatural resistance to questioning. Eleanor was about to face a legal system that was specifically designed to prove that accused witches were guilty of supernatural crimes, operated by people who had years of experience making these charges stick. What made the situation particularly tragic was that Eleanor's growing reputation for supernatural abilities was attracting exactly the kind of official attention that would make her situation infinitely worse, while she remained completely oblivious to the danger she was facing. The crisis reached its peak on a Tuesday morning in October, when Eleanor made the catastrophic mistake of trying to help solve a problem that was already being attributed to supernatural causes. The village's grain stores had been contaminated by what we'd now recognize as ergot fungus, causing several people to become seriously ill with symptoms that included hallucinations, convulsions, and temporary paralysis. To Eleanor's neighbors, this looked exactly like what they'd expect to happen when a witch decided to curse the community's food supply. Eleanor, who had learned about grain storage from her merchant father and recognized the symptoms of ergot poisoning from descriptions in his trading journals, made the fatal error of trying to explain what was actually happening. She approached the village elders and attempted to describe how improper grain storage in damp conditions could lead to fungal contamination that would cause exactly the symptoms people were experiencing. She even offered to show them how to identify the contaminated grain and explained methods for preventing future contamination. To people who were already convinced that Eleanor had supernatural abilities, her detailed knowledge of the exact cause of their mysterious illness looked like someone revealing information that only the person responsible for the problem could possibly possess. Eleanor's attempt to help was interpreted as a confession. Clearly, she was so confident in her supernatural powers that she was openly describing her methods of cursing the village food supply. The situation escalated dramatically when Eleanor, frustrated by her neighbor's refusal to listen to her practical explanations, decided to prove her point by demonstrating how to identify contaminated grain. She gathered a group of village women and showed them the telltale signs of ergot contamination, explaining how the dark growths on the grain were the source of the problem and needed to be carefully removed before the grain could be safely consumed. What Eleanor intended as a helpful educational demonstration looked to her audience like a detailed instruction session in supernatural grain cursing techniques. The women watched in horrified fascination as Eleanor handled the contaminated grain with obvious expertise, pointed out specific features that indicated supernatural influence, and demonstrated methods for manipulating these supernatural forces. Several women later testified that Eleanor had seemed almost supernaturally knowledgeable about the curse she had placed on their food. Things went from bad to catastrophic when Eleanor's demonstration actually worked. The grain she'd cleaned using her methods turned out to be safe for consumption, while grain that hadn't been properly treated continued to cause illness. Instead of proving that she'd identified the natural cause of the problem, Eleanor had apparently demonstrated her ability to remove supernatural curses at will. Obviously a power that only the person who had placed the curses could possess. Judge Thornfield arrived in the village 3 days later to find what appeared to be a textbook case of supernatural grain contamination, complete with an accused witch who had openly demonstrated detailed knowledge of the cursing methods and the ability to reverse the supernatural effects. Eleanor's helpful explanation and successful demonstration had provided Thornfield with exactly the kind of clear evidence that made witchcraft cases straightforward to prosecute. The formal examination took place in the village church, with Eleanor facing a panel that included Judge Thornfield, Magistrate Grimsby, and Father Benedict, the local priest who had been trying to stay out of the witchcraft discussion, but was now required to provide spiritual expertise. Eleanor answered their questions with the same honest directness that had gotten her into trouble with Grimsby's investigation, not understanding that her detailed explanations were being recorded as comprehensive confessions of supernatural activity. When Thornfield asked Eleanor to explain how she had learned to identify and reverse grain curses, Eleanor tried to describe her father's merchant business and the practical knowledge she'd gained about food storage and contamination. To Thornfield, this sounded like someone describing a family tradition of supernatural learning. Exactly the kind of hereditary witchcraft that his legal manuals had taught him to look for. The examination's climactic moment came when Thornfield asked Eleanor to demonstrate her grain purification abilities under controlled conditions. Eleanor, still believing that proving her methods worked would establish her innocence, successfully identified and cleaned contaminated grain while explaining her process step by step. Thornfield carefully documented her performance as a controlled demonstration of supernatural grain manipulation abilities performed under oath, in the presence of legal and religious authorities. The session concluded with Eleanor being formally charged with practicing witchcraft, corrupting the village food supply through supernatural means, and maintaining ongoing communication with supernatural entities for the purpose of harming her neighbors. Eleanor finally realized that her situation had become genuinely dangerous, but by this point, her attempts to prove her innocence had provided her accusers with more compelling evidence than they could have hoped to gather through any other means. The response to Eleanor's formal charging was swift and revealed just how thoroughly the community had convinced itself that she represented a genuine supernatural threat. Village families who had known Eleanor for years suddenly treated her as if she were a dangerous predator who had been living among them in disguise. Children were forbidden from going near her cottage. Women crossed themselves when they saw her, and men discussed the necessity of ensuring that Eleanor couldn't escape or communicate with her supernatural allies before her trial. Father Benedict, who had previously tried to stay neutral about the witchcraft rumors, felt compelled to deliver a series of sermons about the reality of supernatural threats and the importance of vigilance against demonic influences. His reluctant endorsement of the charges against Eleanor carried enormous weight with villagers who had been uncertain about whether the witchcraft accusations were legitimate. If their own priest acknowledged that Eleanor represented a supernatural danger, then clearly the situation was as serious as the legal authorities claimed. The immediate consequences for Eleanor were devastating. Her cottage was searched by officials, looking for supernatural implements and evidence of demonic communication. They found Eleanor's collection of herbs, her mortar and pestle, her father's old trading journals, and various other items that looked appropriately mysterious when viewed through the lens of supernatural investigation. Eleanor's books were particularly damning. The ability to read was already suspicious in a woman, but books that contained knowledge about medicine, agriculture, and foreign customs were clearly evidence of forbidden learning. Eleanor's economic situation collapsed overnight. The small network of people who had occasionally purchased her herbal remedies or sought her advice about practical problems disappeared completely. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who was facing formal witchcraft charges, and anyone who had previously benefited from Eleanor's knowledge now had to worry about whether they might be accused of collaborating with supernatural forces. Perhaps most frightening for Eleanor was discovering how completely her neighbors' perception of her had changed. People who had known her for years now looked at her with genuine fear and spoke about her as if she were a dangerous stranger who had been deceiving them about her true nature. Her attempts to maintain normal social interactions were interpreted as evidence that she was trying to manipulate people through supernatural influence. The political fallout extended beyond Eleanor's personal situation. Judge Thornfield's successful identification of what appeared to be a clear-cut witchcraft case enhanced his professional reputation and validated the investigative methods that had been used. Magistrate Grimsby was commended for his thorough preliminary work, which had provided the foundation for Thornfield's successful prosecution. The case was becoming a model for how supernatural crimes should be investigated and prosecuted. Word of Eleanor's case began spreading to other communities, where it was cited as evidence that supernatural threats were real and that proper legal procedures could successfully identify and neutralize them. Eleanor's situation was inadvertently contributing to a broader pattern of witchcraft prosecutions across the region, as other magistrates sought to demonstrate their own competence by applying similar investigative methods to local suspicious individuals. This case wasn't just about one woman's tragic misunderstanding with her neighbors. It was revealing fundamental problems with how English society was attempting to deal with fears about supernatural threats through legal mechanisms that were systematically designed to confirm rather than challenge accusations. Eleanor's trial demonstrated how well-intentioned people using methods they believed were fair and scientific could create outcomes that were both unjust and completely disconnected from reality. Every step in the process had been handled according to established procedures by people who genuinely believed they were pursuing truth and protecting their community. Yet the result was a legal case built entirely on misinterpreted evidence and flawed assumptions. What the case revealed about the system was that it was structurally incapable of distinguishing between supernatural activity and perfectly normal behavior that happened to look suspicious to people who were already convinced that supernatural threats were real. The legal framework treated witchcraft as a detectable phenomenon that could be identified through proper investigation, rather than considering the possibility that the entire conceptual framework might be wrong. The broader implications were terrifying because Eleanor's case was being handled exactly the way the legal system was supposed to handle witchcraft accusations. This wasn't a case of corruption, incompetence, or malicious prosecution. It was the system working precisely as it had been designed to work. The fact that it was producing completely unjust outcomes based on imaginary crimes wasn't a bug in the system. It was an inevitable result of the system's fundamental assumptions about the nature of supernatural threats. For historians, Eleanor's case illustrates how societies can create elaborate institutional mechanisms for systematically transforming innocent behavior into criminal evidence, while everyone involved believes they are acting rationally and pursuing justice. The same psychological and social dynamics that made Eleanor's prosecution possible appear in different forms throughout history whenever communities become convinced that they face threats that can be identified and eliminated through proper procedures. Why historians still debate cases like Eleanor's is that they reveal uncomfortable truths about how easily rational, well-intentioned people can participate in systems that produce completely irrational outcomes simply because the systems themselves are based on flawed assumptions that nobody thinks to question. Around Eleanor's increasingly dramatic legal situation, a fascinating cast of characters played crucial roles in either escalating or attempting to defuse the crisis, each bringing their own motivations, fears, and spectacular misunderstandings to the unfolding disaster. Martha Wickham emerged as Eleanor's most enthusiastic accuser, not out of malice, but because she discovered that being the primary witness in a witchcraft case gave her a level of social importance she'd never experienced before. Martha had spent years being the village's most overlooked resident, a middle-aged widow with no particular skills, no interesting stories, and no reason for anyone to pay attention to her opinions. Suddenly, magistrates were hanging on her every word, writing down her observations, and treating her testimony as crucial evidence in an important legal case. Martha's detailed descriptions of Eleanor's suspicious activities became increasingly elaborate with each retelling, not because she was deliberately lying, but because she discovered that more dramatic stories earned more attention from her increasingly fascinated audience. Father Benedict represented the church's awkward position in witchcraft cases. He was a genuinely devout man who took his spiritual responsibilities seriously, but he was also pragmatic enough to understand that his congregation expected him to take supernatural threats seriously. Benedict had never actually believed that Eleanor was a witch, but he couldn't publicly express skepticism about witchcraft accusations without appearing to deny church doctrine about the reality of demonic influences. His solution was to focus on Eleanor's spiritual welfare rather than her guilt or innocence, offering to pray for her soul while carefully avoiding any statements that might be interpreted as either supporting or challenging the legal proceedings. Benedict's sermons during this period became masterpieces of theological ambiguity, acknowledging the reality of supernatural evil while avoiding any specific comments about Eleanor's case. Dr. Aldrich, the traveling physician who visited the village quarterly, found himself caught between his medical knowledge and the community's supernatural explanations for recent illnesses. Aldrich recognized the symptoms of ergot poisoning immediately and could have provided scientific explanations that would have completely undermined the witchcraft accusations. However, Aldrich was also a businessman who depended on maintaining good relationships with local authorities and community leaders. Challenging popular beliefs about supernatural causes of illness would damage his reputation and potentially cost him patients who preferred explanations that didn't conflict with their existing worldview. His compromise was to treat symptoms effectively while remaining diplomatically silent about causes, a position that allowed him to maintain his practice while doing nothing to help Eleanor's situation. Young Thomas Grimsby Jr., the magistrate's teenage son, became accidentally crucial to Eleanor's case when he decided to conduct his own investigation to impress his father. Thomas Jr. had been following Eleanor around the village, documenting her activities and trying to observe supernatural behavior that had apparently escaped adult notice. His adolescent enthusiasm for detective work led him to interpret perfectly normal activities as evidence of hidden supernatural practices. Thomas Jr.'s surveillance reports became part of the official case file, adding a layer of detailed documentation that made Eleanor's daily routine look like a carefully planned series of supernatural activities. The irony was that Thomas Jr. genuinely admired Eleanor's intelligence and practical skills, but his teenage desire to demonstrate his investigative abilities led him to systematically document evidence that supported her prosecution. Widow Penelope Ashford played a more complex role as someone who had initially been sympathetic to Eleanor, but gradually became convinced that the accusations might be legitimate. Penelope had appreciated Eleanor's herbal remedies and practical advice, but as the legal case developed, she began reinterpreting their past interactions through the lens of possible supernatural manipulation. Penelope's transformation from ally to suspicious neighbor illustrated how witchcraft accusations could retroactively contaminate relationships, making people question whether their previous positive experiences with the accused had actually been the result of supernatural influence rather than genuine human connection. These weren't isolated incidents of individual paranoia. They formed an interconnected web of relationships and mutual reinforcement that made Eleanor's situation increasingly inescapable. Martha Wickham's enthusiastic testimony encouraged other villagers to come forward with their own suspicious observations, creating a feedback loop where each new accusation made previous accusations seem more credible. The political networks Underlying these relationships were crucial to understanding how Eleanor's case gained momentum. Magistrate Grimsby's friendship with Judge Thornfield meant that Eleanor's case received more serious attention than it might have under different circumstances. Thornfield's professional relationship with other regional authorities meant that Eleanor's prosecution was being watched as a test case for effective witchcraft investigation methods. Success in Eleanor's case would enhance everyone's professional reputation, while failure would suggest incompetence in handling supernatural threats. Father Benedict's reluctant support for the legal proceedings carried enormous weight because it provided religious validation for secular accusations. His careful sermons about the reality of supernatural evil were interpreted by his congregation as confirmation that Eleanor represented a genuine spiritual threat. Benedict's theological authority transformed what might have been dismissed as village gossip into a matter of serious religious concern that required official intervention. Dr. Aldrich's diplomatic silence about the medical aspects of the case eliminated the most credible source of alternative explanations for the symptoms that were being attributed to Eleanor's supernatural activities. His professional credibility could have challenged the supernatural interpretation of recent illnesses, but his decision to avoid controversial topics meant that no authoritative voice was questioning the assumptions underlying Eleanor's prosecution. The P.O.'s economic relationships were equally important. Martha Wickham's newfound importance as a key witness gave her social status that she was reluctant to lose by moderating her accusations. Thomas Jr.'s surveillance activities made him feel useful and important to his father's work, creating incentives for him to find evidence that supported the prosecution. Penelope Ashford's growing suspicions about Eleanor were reinforced by her desire to avoid being associated with someone who might be genuinely dangerous. How one event led to another revealed the self-reinforcing nature of witchcraft accusations. Eleanor's helpful explanation of ergot poisoning was interpreted as a supernatural confession, which encouraged more people to come forward with their own observations of suspicious behavior. Each new piece of testimony made previous accusations seem more credible, while also providing context that made Eleanor's past behavior appear more sinister in retrospect. The unintended consequences were particularly tragic because many of the people contributing to Eleanor's prosecution genuinely liked her and would have preferred to help her if they could have done so without risking their own safety. The community was essentially trapped in a situation where social and legal pressures made it dangerous to express skepticism about Eleanor's guilt, even for people who privately doubted the accusations. Most ironically, Eleanor's case was creating exactly the kind of community solidarity that witchcraft prosecutions were supposed to foster, but it was unity based on shared fear and mutual surveillance rather than genuine cooperation and trust. To understand Eleanor's tragic situation, you have to understand that daily life in 1600s rural England was dominated by uncertainties that modern people can barely imagine. Death was a constant presence. Children died regularly, harvests failed unpredictably, and illnesses struck without warning or explanation. In a world where people had no understanding of bacteria, viruses, genetics, or weather patterns, supernatural explanations weren't irrational superstitions. They were the best available theories for making sense of a frequently hostile and unpredictable environment. Beliefs and attitudes about women's roles made Eleanor's independence particularly threatening to social order. A woman who could support herself financially, solve practical problems without male assistance, and possess knowledge that seemed beyond normal female capabilities, challenged fundamental assumptions about gender hierarchy and social organization. Eleanor's competence wasn't just unusual. It was potentially destabilizing to a social system that depended on clearly defined roles and limitations. Social structures in village life were based on mutual dependence and careful maintenance of Established relationships. Everyone knew their place in the community hierarchy, understood their obligations to neighbors, and followed social scripts that had been developed over generations. Eleanor's tendency to think independently and solve problems creatively marked her as someone who didn't properly understand or respect these established patterns. What was considered normal versus exceptional revealed the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior for women in this period. Normal women were supposed to be dependent, deferential, and limited in their knowledge and capabilities. Exceptional women, those who exceeded these limitations, were automatically suspect because their abilities suggested either divine favor, which should be accompanied by obvious piety and humility, or supernatural assistance from less holy sources. The distinction between acceptable and dangerous knowledge was particularly important for understanding Eleanor's situation. Women were expected to know certain things: basic cooking, childcare, and simple remedies for common ailments. But detailed knowledge about agriculture, medicine, or natural phenomena was considered inappropriate for women and potentially dangerous to social order. Eleanor's broad knowledge base and analytical thinking abilities marked her as someone who had clearly exceeded the boundaries of acceptable female learning. How this cultural context shaped events was crucial because it meant that Eleanor's prosecution wasn't an aberration. It was a logical response to behavior that genuinely threatened established social norms. The community wasn't irrationally persecuting an innocent woman. They were rationally responding to someone who represented real challenges to their understanding of how society should function, using legal mechanisms that were specifically designed to address these kinds of threats. Perhaps most tragically ironic was how Eleanor's genuine desire to help her community became the primary evidence for her prosecution. Every attempt she made to solve problems, share knowledge, or improve conditions was systematically reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation. Her kindness was treated as a suspicious attempt to gain influence over her neighbors. Her knowledge was seen as proof of forbidden learning, and her success at solving problems was viewed as confirmation of supernatural abilities. The contradictions in community logic would have been amusing if they weren't so dangerous for Eleanor. Villagers simultaneously believed that Eleanor was powerful enough to control supernatural forces, and yet somehow incompetent enough to accidentally reveal her methods to anyone who asked. They thought she could curse their crops and livestock, but apparently couldn't manage to grow her own vegetables in straight lines. They credited her with the ability to see the future, but assumed she hadn't foreseen her own legal troubles. Even more contradictory was the relationship between the community's fear of Eleanor and their continued dependence on her knowledge. The same people who testified about her dangerous supernatural abilities continued to secretly seek her advice about problems that conventional wisdom couldn't solve. They were terrified of her supposed powers, but couldn't resist consulting those same powers when they needed help with sick children, failed crops, or family disputes. The legal system created its own contradictions by treating Eleanor's intelligence and competence as evidence of supernatural corruption, while simultaneously expecting her to be able to defend herself through rational argument and logical explanation. The same analytical abilities that made her seem dangerously unnatural were the tools she was expected to use to prove her innocence. Modern parallels to these contradictions appear whenever communities become convinced that certain types of people represent existential threats that can be identified and eliminated through proper procedures. The specific supernatural beliefs were products of their historical context, but the underlying psychological patterns of finding scapegoats for complex problems, interpreting normal behavior as threatening when performed by designated outsiders, and using systematic methods to confirm rather than challenge existing biases remained disturbingly familiar. Everything changed when Eleanor's case attracted the attention of someone who had never been part of the village's supernatural drama, Sir Edmund Hartwell, a minor nobleman whose estate included Eleanor's village, but who had previously paid little attention to local legal proceedings. Hartwell wasn't some enlightened skeptic who understood that witchcraft accusations were nonsense. He was just as willing to believe in supernatural threats as anyone else in 1600s England. What made Hartwell different was that he approached Eleanor's case from an entirely different perspective, not as a supernatural investigation, but as a property management issue. The background to Hartwell's intervention was purely practical. Eleanor's cottage and small plot of land were technically part of his estate, and her execution for witchcraft would mean that her property would revert to his control. Normally, this would be a minor financial benefit that wouldn't require his personal attention. However, Hartwell had recently discovered that Eleanor's land contained something unexpectedly valuable, a natural spring that produced unusually pure water, which had become valuable for certain manufacturing processes that Hartwell was trying to establish in the region. Hartwell's interest in Eleanor's case was entirely mercenary. He wanted to maintain control over her property while she was alive, because executing her for witchcraft would draw unwanted attention to the land and potentially complicate his plans to develop the water source for commercial purposes. His intervention wasn't motivated by justice or skepticism about supernatural accusations. He simply needed Eleanor to remain alive and legally competent so that he could negotiate access to her spring without dealing with the bureaucratic complications that would arise if the land became part of a witchcraft forfeiture. Why this moment was different from all the previous developments in Eleanor's case was that Hartwell brought resources and authority that were completely outside the local power structure that had been driving her prosecution. Judge Thornfield, Magistrate Grimsby, and the village authorities had been operating within a closed system where everyone shared the same assumptions about supernatural threats and proper investigative methods. Hartwell represented an external perspective that wasn't invested in validating the work that had already been done. Key factors that led to this transformation were entirely coincidental. Hartwell's business interests happened to intersect with Eleanor's legal troubles at exactly the moment when her case was moving toward trial and execution. If his commercial plans had developed a few months later, or if Eleanor's land hadn't contained the specific natural resources he needed, her case would have proceeded to its logical conclusion without any outside intervention. The timing was pure accident, but it created an opportunity for someone with sufficient authority to challenge the momentum that had been building toward Eleanor's conviction. What made Hartwell's intervention particularly effective was that he didn't need to challenge anyone's beliefs about witchcraft or question the validity of supernatural investigations. He simply needed to raise practical questions about whether the legal proceedings were being handled in ways that served broader interest beyond just the immediate question of Eleanor's guilt or innocence. Hartwell's intervention began not with dramatic confrontations or legal challenges, but with a series of polite inquiries about procedural details that gradually revealed how much the local authorities had invested in reaching a predetermined conclusion. His first meeting with Judge Thornfield was ostensibly about confirming the legal procedures for property transfer in witchcraft cases, but it quickly became apparent that Hartwell was asking questions that nobody had thought to ask before. When Hartwell requested copies of the evidence that had been compiled against Eleanor, Thornfield was initially pleased to share documentation that demonstrated the thoroughness of his investigation. However, Hartwell's reaction to the evidence was not what Thornfield had expected. Instead of being impressed by the comprehensive case that had been built, Hartwell began asking practical questions about alternative explanations for the behaviors that had been interpreted as supernatural activities. Hartwell's approach was devastatingly effective because he wasn't challenging the reality of witchcraft or questioning anyone's competence. He was simply applying the same kind of practical analysis he used for managing his business interests. When shown the evidence about Eleanor's unusual success with herbal remedies, Hartwell asked whether anyone had investigated where she might have learned these techniques and whether they might be reproducible by other people. When presented with testimony about her ability to predict weather and agricultural problems, Hartwell inquired about whether her predictions had been systematically recorded and verified, and whether her success rate was actually better than chance. The resistance to Hartwell's questions revealed how much the local authorities had become invested in Eleanor's guilt. Magistrate Grimsby initially responded to Hartwell's inquiries with enthusiasm, assuming that a nobleman's interest would validate the importance of his work. However, as Hartwell continued asking for clarification and additional documentation, Grimsby became defensive about suggestions that his investigation might have been incomplete or biased. Judge Thornfield's reaction was more complex because he recognized that Hartwell's questions were the kind that might be asked by higher authorities if Eleanor's case was appealed or reviewed. Thornfield had built his reputation on conducting thorough witchcraft prosecutions that could withstand scrutiny, but he was beginning to realize that his investigation had been thorough only within the narrow framework of confirming supernatural activity, rather than thoroughly examining all possible explanations for the observed evidence. Champions of change emerged in unexpected ways as Hartwell's intervention created space for people who had been privately skeptical about Eleanor's case to begin expressing their doubts. Dr. Aldrich, who had remained diplomatically silent about the medical aspects of the case, found himself in a private meeting with Hartwell where he could finally discuss his professional opinion about the ergot poisoning without risking his reputation with local authorities. Specific steps in the transformation process included Hartwell's systematic review of the evidence, his interviews with key witnesses, and his consultation with external experts who could provide alternative explanations for the phenomena that had been attributed to Eleanor's supernatural activities. Each step revealed gaps in the investigation that had been overlooked because everyone involved had been looking for evidence of witchcraft rather than trying to determine what had actually happened. Obstacles encountered included the institutional momentum that had built up around Eleanor's prosecution, the personal and professional investments that local authorities had made in proving her guilt, and the community's emotional commitment to the supernatural explanation for their recent problems. Overcoming these obstacles required Hartwell to find ways to allow people to change their positions without admitting that they had been fundamentally wrong. Breakthrough moments occurred when Hartwell arranged for practical demonstrations of Eleanor's methods under controlled conditions that ruled out supernatural explanations. When Eleanor's herbal remedies were tested by Dr. Aldrich using standard medical evaluation techniques, they proved to be effective treatments based on sound pharmacological principles. When her weather prediction methods were examined by someone with knowledge of agricultural science, they turned out to be based on systematic observation of environmental indicators that could be taught to other people. The role of individuals versus larger forces was crucial because Hartwell's intervention only worked because it aligned with broader concerns about property rights, legal procedures, and economic development that transcended local interests in supernatural persecution. Individual personalities mattered. Hartwell's practical approach, Dr. Aldrich's medical expertise, and even Eleanor's willingness to cooperate with testing. But these individual contributions were only effective because they addressed systemic problems with how witchcraft cases were being investigated and prosecuted. The new situation that emerged from Hartwell's intervention was fundamentally different from the legal and social dynamics that had been driving Eleanor's prosecution. Instead of a community united in fear of supernatural threats, the village found itself divided between people who remained convinced of Eleanor's guilt and those who were beginning to question whether the entire case might have been based on misunderstandings. How things were different was immediately apparent in the changed tone of official proceedings. Judge Thornfield, faced with Hartwell's systematic questioning and the possibility that his case might be reviewed by higher authorities, began conducting additional investigations that focused on verifying rather than simply documenting the supernatural explanations for Eleanor's behavior. Magistrate Grimsby found himself in the awkward position of defending investigative methods that had seemed perfectly adequate until they were subjected to external scrutiny. Eleanor's day-to-day experience improved dramatically as Hartwell's intervention created official protection that made it impossible for local authorities to proceed with her prosecution without addressing the questions he had raised. She was no longer facing imminent trial and execution, but she was also not fully exonerated. Her legal status had become uncertain in ways that were simultaneously safer and more frustrating than her previous situation. Who won and who lost? From these changes revealed the complex interests that had been at stake in Eleanor's case. Hartwell achieved his immediate goal of protecting his access to Eleanor's property, while also positioning himself as someone who had prevented a potential miscarriage of justice. Eleanor gained temporary safety, but remained under suspicion and social isolation. Judge Thornfield and Magistrate Grimsby found their professional reputations complicated by questions about their investigative methods. But they weren't directly blamed for any wrongdoing since they had been following established procedures. New rules and norms began emerging as Hartwell's intervention established precedents for how witchcraft accusations should be evaluated. Local authorities became more cautious about proceeding with supernatural prosecutions without considering alternative explanations, not because they had stopped believing in witchcraft, but because they recognized that inadequately investigated cases could be challenged by people with sufficient authority and resources. The village community experienced the most complex changes, as people who had been united in their fear of Eleanor found themselves uncertain about what they should believe. Some villagers doubled down on their conviction that Eleanor was dangerous, interpreting Hartwell's intervention as evidence that powerful people were protecting her for their own mysterious reasons. Others began quietly questioning whether they might have been wrong about Eleanor's supernatural activities, though few were willing to admit this publicly. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically illustrated how deeply the social and psychological foundations of witchcraft accusations were embedded in community life. The underlying fears, prejudices, and social dynamics that had made Eleanor a target for supernatural suspicions remained largely unchanged. People were still just as likely to interpret unusual behavior as potentially threatening, still just as willing to accept supernatural explanations for problems they couldn't otherwise understand, and still just as resistant to acknowledging when they might have been wrong about serious accusations. What changed dramatically was the immediate legal and social pressure that had been driving Eleanor toward conviction and execution. Hartwell's intervention had disrupted the momentum of her prosecution, but it hadn't fundamentally altered the community attitudes and institutional biases that had created her situation in the first place. Eleanor was safer, but the conditions that had made her vulnerable to witchcraft accusations remained largely intact. Was this change positive or negative for Eleanor and the broader community? The answer was complicated, because Hartwell's intervention had solved Eleanor's immediate problem of facing execution while leaving many of the underlying issues unresolved. Eleanor was no longer in immediate danger, but she remained socially isolated and under suspicion. The legal system had been forced to slow down and reconsider its procedures, but it hadn't fundamentally changed its approach to supernatural accusations. Different perspectives on these developments revealed the complexity of evaluating outcomes in cases where institutional systems were producing unjust results. From Eleanor's viewpoint, any change that prevented her execution was obviously positive. even if it didn't fully restore her reputation or social standing. From the community's perspective, the intervention had created uncertainty and conflict. Where there had previously been consensus, which many people experienced as destabilizing rather than beneficial. Short-term versus long-term effects were particularly important to consider because Hartwell's intervention had primarily addressed the immediate symptoms of the problem rather than its underlying causes. In the short term, Eleanor was safer, and local authorities were more cautious about witchcraft prosecutions. In the long term, however, the fundamental social and legal structures that had made Eleanor's prosecution possible remained unchanged, which meant that future cases might develop along similar lines. Unintended consequences included the creation of precedents that could be used by other people with sufficient resources and authority to challenge witchcraft prosecutions, but also the establishment of the principle that supernatural accusations could be subject to practical evaluation by secular authorities. This could potentially protect other accused individuals, but it also meant that successful prosecutions would need to meet higher standards of evidence, which might paradoxically make future cases more convincing. Modern judgment versus contemporary. Views highlighted how differently people in 1600s England and today would evaluate the outcomes of Eleanor's case. Contemporary observers would likely focus on whether proper legal procedures had been followed and whether community order had been maintained, rather than on questions about justice or individual rights that seem obvious to modern perspectives. The fact that Eleanor had avoided execution might be seen as evidence that the system had worked correctly, rather than as a fortunate accident that had prevented a serious injustice. In the months and years that followed Hartwell's intervention, Eleanor's life evolved into something that was simultaneously safer and more isolated than anything she had experienced before. She was no longer facing immediate execution, but she had also become a permanent curiosity in her own community. The woman, who had almost been convicted of witchcraft, but had somehow escaped through the intervention of mysterious, powerful forces that nobody fully understood. The new challenges Eleanor faced were in many ways more psychologically difficult than the original accusations had been. When she had been facing trial and execution, at least her situation had been clear and her enemies identifiable. Now, she existed in a strange limbo where some people still believed she was dangerous. Others weren't sure what to think, and everyone treated her with a mixture of wariness and fascination that made normal social interaction nearly impossible. Eleanor's attempts to rebuild her life were complicated by the fact that her reputation had evolved in directions that made her simultaneously more valuable and more dangerous to her neighbors. People who had previously avoided her because they feared her supernatural powers now sought her out specifically because they believed she had supernatural powers. Eleanor found herself receiving visits from people who wanted magical solutions to their problems, even though she repeatedly explained that she had no magical abilities and had never claimed to possess any. The evolution of her situation revealed how difficult it was to escape the social consequences of witchcraft accusations, even when the legal threats had been resolved. Eleanor's knowledge and practical skills, which had originally gotten her into trouble by seeming supernatural, continued to set her apart from her neighbors in ways that reinforced their sense that she was fundamentally different from normal. People doubted second-generation effects of her case became apparent as Eleanor's story spread beyond her immediate community and became part of regional folklore about supernatural threats and legal interventions. Other communities began using Eleanor's case as a reference point for their own suspicious activities, either as an example of how dangerous witches could be successfully identified, or as a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough investigation. Before proceeding with supernatural prosecutions, Eleanor herself struggled with the psychological aftermath of having been systematically misunderstood, and nearly executed by people she had considered friends and neighbors. The experience had fundamentally changed her relationship with the community she had tried to help, leaving her uncertain about whether it was safe to be helpful, whether her knowledge was welcome, and whether she could trust the people around her to interpret her actions charitably rather than suspiciously. Most frustratingly, Eleanor discovered that explaining what had actually happened was nearly impossible, because the true story that she had almost been executed for being good at practical problem solving seemed less believable to most people than the supernatural explanations that had originally gotten her into trouble. People found it easier to believe that she had magical powers than to accept that their community had almost executed someone for being competent. The aftermath of Eleanor's case attracted several new figures who brought different perspectives and agendas to the ongoing questions about supernatural threats and legal procedures in the region. These newcomers would shape how Eleanor's story continued to develop and influence broader approaches to witchcraft accusations. Brother Francis, a traveling monk who specialized in distinguishing between genuine supernatural phenomena and natural explanations, arrived in the village 6 months after Hartwell's intervention. Francis had been sent by church authorities who were concerned about the increasing number of witchcraft cases in the region and wanted to ensure that legitimate supernatural threats were being properly identified while avoiding persecution of innocent people. Francis brought a more sophisticated theological approach to supernatural investigations, but his methods were still based on the assumption that witchcraft was real and detectable, rather than questioning whether the entire framework might be flawed. Francis's role in Eleanor's ongoing situation was complex because he was simultaneously more knowledgeable about supernatural matters than the local authorities had been, and more systematic about considering alternative explanations for apparently supernatural phenomena. His evaluation of Eleanor concluded that she was probably not a witch, but his reasoning was based on theological criteria about how genuine witchcraft should manifest rather than on skepticism about supernatural explanations in general. Lady Catherine Meredith, a noblewoman who had developed an interest in what she called natural philosophy, became fascinated by Eleanor's case as an example of how practical knowledge could be mistaken for supernatural abilities. Meredith represented the beginning of what would later become scientific approaches to understanding natural phenomena, though her methods were still primitive by modern standards. Her contributions to Eleanor's situation included systematic documentation of Eleanor's practical techniques and attempts to teach them to other people as a way of demonstrating that they were based on learnable skills rather than supernatural powers. Meredith's interactions with Eleanor revealed both the possibilities and limitations of early scientific thinking. While Meredith was interested in understanding how Eleanor's methods actually worked, she was also fascinated by the possibility that Eleanor might represent a transitional figure between traditional supernatural practices and more rational approaches to problem solving. Meredith's theoretical framework was sophisticated enough to recognize that Eleanor's knowledge was based on observable principles, but not sophisticated enough to completely abandon supernatural explanations for phenomena that seemed particularly mysterious. Captain James Whitmore, a military official responsible for regional security, became involved in Eleanor's case because of concerns that witchcraft accusations were being used to mask other forms of social disorder. Whitmore's approach to the situation was purely practical. He was interested in maintaining stability and preventing the kind of community conflicts that could escalate into broader social problems. His contribution was to establish clearer procedures for investigating supernatural accusations that would reduce the likelihood of innocent people being caught up in mass hysteria. These new players differed from earlier figures in Eleanor's story because they brought external perspectives that weren't shaped by the local community dynamics that had originally created her problems. Their involvement represented the beginning of more systematic approaches to supernatural accusations, though these approaches were still based on assumptions about the reality of supernatural threats, rather than fundamental skepticism about whether such threats actually existed. Their specific contributions to Eleanor's ongoing story included more sophisticated methods for evaluating supernatural claims, better documentation of the practical techniques that had been misinterpreted as supernatural abilities, and the establishment of procedures that would make future witchcraft accusations less likely to result in executions based on insufficient evidence. But some problems persisted despite all the interventions and investigations that had complicated Eleanor's case. The fundamental social dynamics that had made her vulnerable to supernatural accusations in the first place remained largely unchanged, which meant that Eleanor continued to face challenges that were rooted in her community's basic attitudes about women, knowledge, and social conformity. Continuing challenges included Eleanor's permanent status as someone who was different in ways that made her neighbors uncomfortable. Even people who no longer believed she was a witch still found her intelligence and independence threatening to their assumptions about how women should behave. Eleanor's practical skills and analytical thinking continued to set her apart from her community in ways that reinforced social isolation, even when they were no longer interpreted as evidence of supernatural activities. What didn't get resolved was the underlying suspicion that Eleanor represented some kind of challenge to established social order, whether supernatural or natural. Her case had raised questions about the reliability of traditional methods for identifying threats to community stability, but it hadn't provided alternative frameworks for dealing with people who didn't fit conventional social categories. Eleanor remained problematic for her community, not because she was dangerous, but because she was difficult to categorize in ways that made people comfortable. New versions of old problems emerged as Eleanor's reputation evolved from suspected witch to mysterious woman with unusual abilities. People who approached her seeking magical solutions to their problems created new forms of social pressure and misunderstanding. Eleanor found herself having to repeatedly explain that she couldn't perform miracles, predict the future, or solve problems that had no practical solutions. But these explanations often disappointed people who had hoped she could provide supernatural assistance. Cyclical patterns became apparent as other women in the region who possessed unusual knowledge or skills found themselves facing similar scrutiny and suspicion. Eleanor's case had established precedents for how such situations should be investigated, but it hadn't changed the basic social attitudes that made competent, independent women seem threatening to community stability. The specific supernatural accusations might be handled more carefully, but the underlying dynamic of finding reasons to marginalize women who exceeded expected limitations continued to operate. Why certain issues proved intractable was partly because they were rooted in fundamental assumptions about social organization that went far beyond questions about supernatural threats. Eleanor's case had revealed how communities used accusations of deviance to enforce conformity and maintain existing power structures. But addressing these deeper issues would have required changes to basic social and economic arrangements that nobody was prepared to consider. The persistence of these problems was also related to the fact that Eleanor's case had been resolved through individual intervention rather than systematic reform. Hartwell's protection had saved Eleanor from execution, but it hadn't changed the legal, social, or economic structures that had made her vulnerable in the first place. Future cases would likely develop along similar lines unless more fundamental changes occurred in how communities dealt with people who challenged established norms. Most frustratingly, Eleanor's ongoing situation demonstrated how difficult it was to restore someone's reputation and social standing once they have been subjected to serious accusations, even when those accusations had been officially questioned or withdrawn. The social damage from witchcraft accusations proved to be more lasting than the legal consequences. creating permanent changes in how Eleanor was perceived and treated by her community that would continue to affect her life regardless of any official determinations about her guilt or innocence. Compared to other witchcraft cases from the same period, Eleanor's situation was unusual primarily because of the external intervention that had prevented her prosecution from reaching its typical conclusion. Most accusations during this period proceeded through established legal channels to conviction and execution, without the kind of systematic questioning of evidence and procedures that Hartwell's involvement had introduced. What was unique about it? Eleanor's case was the combination of factors that had made intervention possible: her residence on valuable property, the coincidental timing of Hartwell's business interests, and the specific nature of the evidence against her that could be subjected to practical testing. Most accused individuals lacked the resources or connections that would bring their cases to the attention of people with sufficient authority to challenge local legal proceedings. What was universal in Eleanor's experience were the social and psychological dynamics that had made her a target for supernatural accusations in the first place. Women who possessed unusual knowledge, lived independently, or challenged social expectations faced similar risks across England and throughout Europe during this period. The specific details of accusations varied, but the underlying pattern of using supernatural explanations to marginalize threatening individuals appeared consistently across different communities and time periods. Lessons that could be learned from Eleanor's case included the importance of systematic evaluation of evidence, the value of considering alternative explanations for unusual phenomena, and the dangers of allowing community fears to drive legal proceedings without adequate oversight. However, these lessons were difficult to apply systematically because they required changes to basic assumptions about the nature of supernatural threats that most people weren't prepared to make. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the use of practical knowledge as evidence of supernatural abilities, the transformation of helpful behavior into suspicious activities through changes in social context, and the difficulty of defending against accusations that were based on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of the nature of the nature of the nature of the based accusations that were based on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of the nature of the nature of the nature of the nation the stations that were based on fundamental misunderstandings of a based and the face endings and inks about the nature of the nation. ALLEGED crimes. Modern comparisons to Eleanor's situation appear whenever communities become convinced that certain types of people represent existential threats that can be identified and eliminated through proper procedures. The specific beliefs and methods change, but the underlying psychological and social dynamics remain remarkably consistent across different historical periods and cultural contexts, suggesting that Eleanor's experience reveals something fundamental about how human communities deal with uncertainty, fear, and social deviance. By the early 1640s, signs pointed to fundamental shifts in how English communities were approaching the whole question of supernatural threats and village-level social control. Eleanor's case had become part of a broader pattern of witchcraft. Prosecutions that were becoming increasingly expensive, legally complicated, and socially divisive. What key players could see was that the systematic investigation of supernatural accusations required resources and expertise that most communities simply couldn't sustain over extended periods. Warning signs that the era of intensive witchcraft prosecution was becoming unsustainable appeared in several forms. Local magistrates like Grimsby were discovering that thorough supernatural investigations consumed enormous amounts of time and official attention while producing results that were often questioned by higher authorities. The legal system was becoming clogged with cases that required specialized knowledge and extensive documentation, but which rarely produced outcomes that clearly enhanced community security or social stability. Judge Thornfield, and other regional authorities were beginning to notice that successful witchcraft prosecutions often created more problems than they solved. Communities that had executed suspected witches frequently continued to experience the same kinds of difficulties that had originally been attributed to supernatural causes, which raised uncomfortable questions about whether the prosecutions had actually addressed real threats or had simply provided temporary psychological relief through scapegoating. What regional officials could observe, but local authorities often missed, was that witchcraft accusations were becoming predictable responses to recurring social and economic problems, rather than genuine investigations of supernatural activities. The same types of people, independent women, knowledgeable individuals, social outsiders, were repeatedly accused in different communities using similar evidence and reasoning, which suggested that the accusations reflected social tensions, rather than actual supernatural threats. Resistance to inevitable change was strongest among people who had built their reputations and careers on expertise in supernatural investigation. Magistrates, judges, and religious authorities who had invested years in developing methods for identifying and prosecuting witches were reluctant to acknowledge that their specialized knowledge might be based on flawed assumptions. Their professional identities were tied to the belief that supernatural threats were real and that they possessed the skills necessary to protect their communities from these dangers. The economic costs of maintaining intensive supernatural surveillance were becoming impossible to ignore. Thorough witchcraft investigations required extensive official time, specialized consultation, detailed documentation, and often prolonged imprisonment of accused individuals while cases were being resolved. Communities were beginning to question whether these costs were justified by the actual security benefits they provided. Social costs were equally important, because witchcraft accusations created lasting divisions within communities that were difficult to repair even after cases were resolved. Eleanor's village remained split between people who continued to believe she was dangerous and those who thought the entire case had been a mistake, creating ongoing tensions that interfered with the cooperation and mutual trust that rural communities needed to function effectively. Perhaps most significantly, the political context was shifting as England moved toward the social and political upheavals that would culminate in civil war. Regional authorities were becoming more concerned with maintaining basic order and preventing large-scale social disruption than with investigating individual cases of suspected supernatural activity. The resources and attention that had been devoted to witchcraft prosecutions were increasingly needed for dealing with more immediate and clearly defined political threats. Eleanor's story didn't end with dramatic confrontations or definitive legal resolutions. It gradually faded into the kind of quiet obscurity that characterized how most social conflicts were actually resolved in 1600s England. By 1642, the combination of changing political priorities, economic pressures, and accumulated experience with supernatural investigations had made Eleanor's type of case unlikely to receive the intense official attention that had nearly cost her life. The specific events that marked the end of Eleanor's legal troubles were characteristically bureaucratic and anticlimactic. Sir Edmund Hartwell's continued interest in maintaining control over Eleanor's property had evolved into a more formal arrangement where Eleanor remained on her land as Hartwell's tenant, with specific agreements about access to the spring water that had originally motivated his intervention. This arrangement provided Eleanor with legal protection while giving Hartwell the commercial rights he needed, creating a practical solution that made further legal proceedings unnecessary. Judge Thornfield's involvement in Eleanor's case effectively ended when he was reassigned to deal with more pressing regional security issues related to the growing political conflicts that would soon erupt into civil war. His final report on Eleanor's case concluded that while suspicious activities had been documented, the available evidence was insufficient to warrant execution, and that continued monitoring would be adequate to ensure community safety. This carefully worded conclusion allowed Thornfile to avoid admitting that his investigation had been flawed, while also avoiding the need to proceed with a prosecution that had become politically and legally complicated. Magistrate Grimsby found himself gradually excluded from supernatural investigations as regional authorities implemented new procedures that required more specialized expertise and oversight than local magistrates typically possessed. Eleanor's case had revealed the limitations of local investigation methods, leading to centralization of witchcraft prosecutions under authorities who had more resources and experience. Grimsby's career continued, but his role shifted toward more conventional administrative duties that didn't involve supernatural accusations. The village community's relationship with Eleanor evolved into a form of cautious coexistence that acknowledged her presence without fully accepting or rejecting her. People continued to seek her practical advice when they needed solutions to problems that conventional methods couldn't address. But these interactions remained unofficial and somewhat secretive. Eleanor had become a permanent fixture in the community's social landscape, someone who was simultaneously useful and uncomfortable, tolerated but not embraced. Father Benedict's role in resolving the supernatural tensions involved a gradual shift in emphasis from identifying and confronting supernatural threats to promoting spiritual practices that would strengthen the community's resistance to evil influences. His sermons began focusing more on positive religious observance and less on the dangers of witchcraft, reflecting broader church policies that were becoming more cautious about encouraging local supernatural investigations that could spiral out of control. The final major players in Eleanor's story included Dr. Aldrich, who had quietly established himself as an unofficial consultant for evaluating the medical aspects of supernatural accusations, and Lady Catherine Meredith, who continued her efforts to document and understand Eleanor's practical techniques as part of her broader interest in natural philosophy. These ongoing relationships provided Eleanor with some measure of protection and intellectual companionship, even as her broader social isolation continued. Symbolic endpoints to Eleanor's case included the formal closure of her legal file in the regional court records, the completion of Hartwell's commercial arrangements for accessing her spring water, and the gradual cessation of official monitoring of her activities. None of these represented dramatic resolutions or clear vindications, but together they marked the end of the period when Eleanor's life was subject to intense official scrutiny and legal threat. The most significant aspect of how Eleanor's case ended was that it simply stopped being actively pursued rather than being definitively resolved. The political and social pressures that had driven her prosecution gradually shifted to other concerns, leaving Eleanor in a state of de facto safety that was based more on neglect than on any official determination of her innocence or guilt. This anticlimactic conclusion was typical of how many witchcraft cases actually ended, not through dramatic trials or clear vindications, but through bureaucratic inertia and changing priorities that made continued prosecution impractical or unnecessary. Eleanor's case ended not because anyone had definitively proven her innocence or fundamentally changed their beliefs about supernatural threats, but because the social, economic, and political systems that had sustained her prosecution could no longer maintain the intensive focus that witchcraft cases required. The analysis of what caused this shift reveals how institutional changes often occur through practical pressures rather than ideological transformations. Internal problems with the witchcraft prosecution system had been accumulating throughout Eleanor's case and similar proceedings across the region. The legal framework for supernatural investigations was proving to be enormously resource-intensive while producing ambiguous results that often failed to resolve the community problems they were supposed to address. Magistrates and judges were discovering that thorough supernatural investigations required expertise, time, and documentation that strained their administrative capabilities without providing clear benefits that justified these costs. External pressures were equally important in ending Eleanor's case. The political instability that was building toward civil war meant that regional authorities needed to focus their attention and resources on more immediate security threats than individual supernatural accusations. The economic disruptions associated with political conflict made communities less willing to invest in expensive legal proceedings that didn't directly address their most pressing survival needs. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending Eleanor's case illustrates how personal decisions and broader social changes interact to produce outcomes that nobody specifically planned or intended. Hartwell's individual decision to protect his commercial interests happened to align with broader trends toward more centralized and systematic approaches to legal proceedings. Thornfield's reassignment to other duties reflected individual career development within the context of changing institutional priorities. What could have been done differently to prevent Eleanor's persecution in the first place would have required fundamental changes to social attitudes about women's roles, the nature of knowledge, and the appropriate responses to unexplained problems. However, these changes would have challenged basic assumptions about social organization that were deeply embedded in 1600s English culture. Eleanor's case was a symptom of broader social dynamics rather than an isolated problem that could have been easily prevented through different individual decisions. The question of inevitability versus contingency in Eleanor's case is complex, because her specific situation resulted from a unique combination of personal characteristics, community dynamics, and historical circumstances that could easily have developed differently. If Eleanor had been less knowledgeable, less independent, or less helpful to her neighbors, she might never have attracted supernatural suspicions. If Hartwell hadn't needed access to her spring water, her prosecution might have proceeded to execution. If political conditions had remained stable, intensive witchcraft investigations might have continued for decades longer. However, the broader pattern of using supernatural accusations to marginalize socially threatening individuals was deeply embedded in the social structures of the period, which suggests that if Eleanor hadn't become a target, someone else with similar characteristics probably would have faced comparable persecution. The specific details of her case were contingent on individual circumstances, but the underlying dynamic was systematic and predictable. The ending of Eleanor's case reflected broader historical forces that were making intensive supernatural persecution increasingly impractical, but it also depended on specific individual decisions and coincidental circumstances that could easily have developed differently. Understanding why her case ended requires recognizing both the systematic pressures that were changing how English society approached supernatural accusations and the particular combination of factors that made resolution possible in Eleanor's specific situation. The immediate aftermath of Eleanor's case was characterized by cautious adjustments, rather than dramatic transformations in how the community and legal system approached supernatural accusations. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the conclusion of Eleanor's prosecution were primarily regional authorities who implemented more centralized oversight of witchcraft investigations, reducing the autonomy that local magistrates had previously enjoyed in handling supernatural accusations. Short-term consequences included the establishment of new procedures that required additional documentation and external consultation before witchcraft prosecutions could proceed to trial. Eleanor's case had demonstrated the problems that could arise when local authorities pursued supernatural investigations without adequate oversight, leading to bureaucratic reforms that were designed to prevent similar complications in future cases. Contemporary reactions to the resolution of Eleanor's Cases were mixed and revealed ongoing divisions about supernatural threats and appropriate legal responses. People who had been convinced of Eleanor's guilt interpreted the conclusion of her case as evidence that powerful interests were protecting dangerous individuals for their own mysterious purposes. Those who had developed doubts about the accusations saw the outcome as validation of their skepticism, though few were willing to express this view publicly. Attempts at revival or continuation of Eleanor's prosecution periodically emerged over the following years, usually in response to new problems or conflicts in the village that some people wanted to attribute to her continued supernatural activities. However, these efforts were consistently blocked by the new procedural requirements and protection that Hartwell's ongoing interest in Eleanor's property provided. The broader impact on regional witchcraft prosecutions was significant because Eleanor's case had established precedents for questioning evidence and requiring external consultation that made future cases more difficult and expensive to pursue. While beliefs about supernatural threats remained widespread, the practical barriers to acting on these beliefs had increased substantially. Eleanor's case also contributed to the development of more sophisticated approaches to distinguishing between genuine supernatural threats and cases that might be based on misunderstandings or social conflicts. This didn't represent fundamental skepticism about witchcraft, but rather an evolution toward more systematic and careful evaluation of supernatural accusations that would reduce the likelihood of innocent people being caught up in community hysteria. The immediate legacy was therefore a more cautious and bureaucratic approach to supernatural accusations rather than any fundamental change in beliefs about the reality of supernatural threats or the importance of protecting communities from these dangers. The legacy of Eleanor's case shaped later developments in ways that were both more subtle and more significant than anyone at the time could have anticipated. Her story became part of a broader transformation in how English legal and social institutions approached the complex relationship between individual competence, community suspicion, and official authority that would influence legal thinking for centuries to come. Specific influences of Eleanor's case appeared in the gradual evolution of legal procedures that required more systematic evaluation of evidence before serious accusations could proceed to trial. The problems that Hartwell's intervention had revealed about local magistrates conducting supernatural investigations without adequate oversight contributed to broader reforms that centralized authority over serious criminal cases and established requirements for external consultation before proceeding with prosecutions that could result in execution. How later generations viewed Eleanor's case reflected changing attitudes about the relationship between knowledge, gender, and social authority. By the late 1600s, Eleanor's story was being retold as an example of how communities could mistakenly persecute valuable individuals whose knowledge and skills should have been appreciated rather than feared. This reinterpretation didn't represent fundamental skepticism about supernatural threats, but rather evolved understanding of how to distinguish between genuine dangers and cases where useful individuals had been misunderstood. Myths versus realities that developed around Eleanor's case illustrate how historical stories are often simplified and distorted to serve contemporary purposes. Popular versions of her story tended to emphasize either her innocence and the community's irrationality, or her mysterious powers and the authorities' wise intervention, depending on what lessons different audiences wanted to draw from her experience. The actual complexity of her situation were well-intentioned. People using reasonable methods had produced unreasonable outcomes, was often lost in these simplified retellings. Why Eleanor's case remained important to legal and academic thinking was that it provided a clear example of how systematic institutional processes could produce completely unjust results, even when everyone involved was acting in good faith according to established procedures. Her story became a case study for understanding how legal systems could be structurally biased in ways that made certain types of injustice inevitable, regardless of the intentions or competence of individual officials. The influence on academic thinking about witchcraft prosecutions was particularly significant because Eleanor's case had been so thoroughly documented that scholars could trace exactly how reasonable evidence had been systematically misinterpreted through institutional processes that were designed to confirm rather than test accusations. This made her story valuable for understanding the psychological and social dynamics underlying not just witchcraft prosecutions, but any institutional system that was designed to identify and eliminate perceived threats. Legal scholars found Eleanor's case particularly useful for examining questions about the burden of proof, the evaluation of expert testimony, and the relationship between local community standards and broader legal principles. Her story illustrated how legal procedures that seemed fair in theory could systematically disadvantage certain types of defendants in practice, particularly when those defendants possessed characteristics that made them seem threatening to established social norms. The case also contributed to evolving understanding of how gender, class, and education intersected with legal vulnerability. Eleanor's prosecution had been possible partly because she was a woman who possessed knowledge and independence that challenged contemporary assumptions about appropriate female behavior. Her story became part of broader discussions about how legal systems could either reinforce or challenge existing social hierarchies. Perhaps most importantly, Eleanor's case demonstrated how individual interventions could disrupt systematic injustice, but also revealed the limitations of depending on such interventions rather than addressing the underlying institutional and social problems that made injustice possible in the first place. Her story remained relevant to later discussions about legal reform because it showed both the potential for individual agency to make a difference and the necessity of systemic change to prevent recurring problems. Today, we can see echoes of Eleanor's experience in how contemporary societies respond to individuals who challenge established norms through knowledge, competence, or independence that makes others uncomfortable. The specific supernatural beliefs that drove Eleanor's persecution have been replaced by different explanatory frameworks, but the underlying psychological and social dynamics remain remarkably consistent across historical periods and cultural context. Modern examples of systematic misinterpretation of competence as threat appear whenever communities become suspicious of individuals who possess unusual knowledge, achieve unexpected success, or operate outside conventional social categories. Women in male-dominated fields often face scrutiny and skepticism that treats their competence as evidence of some kind of illegitimate advantage rather than recognizing their actual skills and knowledge. The assumption that certain types of success must have hidden explanations reflects the same psychological patterns that made Eleanor's neighbors interpret her practical abilities as supernatural powers. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency to seek explanations for problems that preserve existing assumptions about how the world should work rather than challenging those assumptions. When communities face difficulties they can't easily understand or solve, they often focus on identifying individuals who can be blamed for these problems, rather than examining whether their own methods and expectations might be flawed. Eleanor's neighbors found it easier to believe she was cursing their crops than to acknowledge that their agricultural methods might be inadequate. Similar patterns in different contexts appear in how institutions respond to whistleblowers, innovators, or anyone who reveals uncomfortable truths about established practices. The same systematic misinterpretation of helpful information as threatening behavior that characterized Eleanor's case appears in modern organizational responses to employees who identify problems, suggest improvements, or demonstrate that conventional methods are ineffective. The institutional tendency to treat the messenger as the problem, rather than addressing the message, reflects psychological dynamics that transcend specific historical periods. Contemporary parallels in legal and social systems include the ways that certain types of defendants are systematically disadvantaged by procedures that appear fair in theory but operate to confirm existing biases in practice. Eleanor's prosecution succeeded because the legal framework was designed to detect supernatural activity rather than to test whether supernatural activity was actually occurring. Modern legal systems can produce similar outcomes when they are designed around assumptions about certain types of threats or behaviors that may not correspond to empirical reality. The role of expertise in modern institutional decision-making often mirrors the problems that appeared in Eleanor's case, where people with specialized knowledge made systematic errors because their expertise was based on flawed foundational assumptions. Professional competence in applying established methods doesn't prevent systematic injustice when those methods are fundamentally biased or inappropriate for the problems they're supposed to solve. Social media and contemporary communication technologies have created new versions of the community surveillance and rumor amplification that made Eleanor's situation so dangerous. The same dynamics that transformed Eleanor's neighbors' casual observations into formal testimony against her appear in how online communities can systematically interpret normal behavior as evidence of hidden agendas or threatening activities. The speed and reach of modern communication make these processes more rapid and potentially more destructive than they were in Eleanor's time. Lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of questioning institutional assumptions rather than simply improving the efficiency of institutional processes. The need for systematic protection of individuals who challenge established norms through competence or knowledge, and the recognition that well-intentioned people using reasonable methods can produce completely unreasonable outcomes when their underlying assumptions are wrong. Perhaps most importantly, Eleanor's story illustrates how societies can create elaborate systems for identifying and eliminating threats that don't actually exist, while simultaneously failing to address real problems that could be solved through practical action. Her neighbors' focus on supernatural explanations for their difficulties prevented them from learning the practical solutions that Eleanor could have taught them. Just as modern communities sometimes focus on elaborate theories about hidden threats rather than addressing obvious problems through available methods, the persistence of these patterns across different historical periods suggests that understanding cases like Eleanor's isn't just a matter of historical curiosity. It's essential for recognizing how similar dynamics operate in contemporary contexts and developing more effective approaches to preventing systematic injustice in modern institutions. Even now, Eleanor's story influences academic study of how institutions can systematically misinterpret evidence, legal scholarship about the burden of proof in cases involving unconventional defendants, and social research about how communities respond to individuals who challenge established norms through competence or independence. Academic study of witchcraft prosecutions continues to use Eleanor's case as an example of how well-documented historical injustice can reveal the psychological and institutional dynamics that make systematic persecution possible. Her story provides a clear illustration of how reasonable people using established methods can produce completely unreasonable outcomes, making it valuable for understanding not just historical witchcraft prosecutions, but any institutional system that is designed to identify and eliminate perceived threats. Popular culture references to Eleanor's case appear in discussions about false accusations, community hysteria, and the dangers of institutional bias, though these references often simplify her story in ways that obscure the complexity of how her persecution developed. Her case has become a cultural touchstone for discussions about how societies can turn against individuals who are actually trying to help, though the specific details of her experience are often misremembered or mythologized. Political discourse sometimes invokes Eleanor's story as an example of how expert knowledge can be systematically misinterpreted as threatening by people who don't understand it, though these political applications often oversimplify the historical context and ignore the genuine complexity of her situation. Social movements concerned with protecting whistleblowers, defending academic freedom, or challenging institutional bias occasionally reference Eleanor's case as an historical example of how institutions can systematically persecute individuals whose knowledge or competence challenges established assumptions. Why people still care about Eleanor's story is that it provides a clear example of how systematic injustice can develop through the interaction of individual psychology, community dynamics, and institutional processes, making it relevant for understanding contemporary problems that involve similar combinations of factors. The enduring significance of Eleanor Blackthorne's story lies not in its supernatural elements, which were imaginary, but in its demonstration of how real and persistent the human tendencies are that made her persecution possible. Her case reveals patterns of institutional bias, community scapegoating, and systematic misinterpretation of evidence that appear consistently across different historical periods and cultural contexts. What makes Eleanor's story particularly valuable for modern understanding is how thoroughly it was documented, allowing us to trace exactly how reasonable procedures and well-intentioned decisions combine to produce completely unreasonable outcomes. Her case provides a detailed illustration of how individual psychology, social dynamics, and institutional processes interact to create systematic injustice, making it relevant for understanding contemporary problems that involve similar combinations of factors. The tragedy of Eleanor's experience was not that she faced supernatural accusations. It was that her community's genuine desire to understand and address real problems was channeled through institutional frameworks that made accurate understanding impossible. Her neighbors' fears about illness, crop failure, and social disruption were legitimate concerns that deserved serious attention, but the methods they used to address these concerns systematically prevented them from finding effective solutions. Perhaps most importantly, Eleanor's story demonstrates that preventing systematic injustice requires more than good intentions and established procedures. It requires ongoing critical examination of the assumptions underlying institutional processes, and willingness to question whether those assumptions correspond to empirical reality. Our case shows how easily competent, well-intentioned people can participate in systems that produce completely unjust outcomes, simply because they never think to question the foundational beliefs that make those systems seem reasonable. Understanding Eleanor's story isn't just about historical curiosity. It's about recognizing how the same psychological and institutional dynamics that nearly cost her life continue to operate in contemporary contexts, and developing better approaches to preventing similar injustices in modern institutions. Looking back across Eleanor Blackthorne's extraordinary journey from competent village woman to accused witch to cautious survivor, we've witnessed one of history's most perfectly documented examples of how good intentions, reasonable procedures, and well-meaning people can combine to create outcomes that are simultaneously tragic and absurd. Her story encapsulates the fundamental comedy and tragedy of human nature, our persistent ability to systematically misunderstand each other while genuinely trying to do the right thing. The major themes that emerge from Eleanor's experience reveal patterns that extend far beyond 1600s England or supernatural accusations. We've seen how practical knowledge can be systematically misinterpreted as threatening when it challenges established assumptions about who should know what. We've observed how communities under stress can transform their most helpful members into scapegoats for problems that have nothing to do with individual behavior. We've watched institutions designed to pursue justice systematically produce injustice through procedures that confirm rather than test existing biases. Key patterns in Eleanor's story include the tendency for competence to be perceived as threat when it appears in unexpected contexts, the way communities can convince themselves that complex problems have simple explanations involving individual villains, and how institutional momentum can carry unreasonable processes forward long after their flaws have become apparent. These patterns appear consistently across different historical periods and cultural contexts, suggesting they reveal something fundamental about human psychology and social organization. The most surprising discoveries in Eleanor's case were how little actual malice was involved in her persecution and how much genuine concern for community welfare motivated the people who nearly executed her. Martha Wickham wasn't a cruel person seeking to destroy an innocent woman. She was someone who had discovered that being important felt better than being overlooked. Magistrate Grimsby wasn't a corrupt official manufacturing evidence. He was a conscientious administrator, trying to do his job properly, according to established guidelines. Judge Thornfield wasn't a sadistic witch hunter. He was an experienced legal professional applying systematic methods to what appeared to be a clear case. Most important takeaways from Eleanor's experience include the recognition that systematic injustice often results from the interaction of individual psychology, social dynamics, and institutional processes rather than from deliberate malice or obvious corruption. Her story demonstrates how easily reasonable people can participate in unreasonable systems, how institutional competence can coexist with institutional bias, and how well-intentioned reforms can sometimes make systematic problems worse rather than better. How our understanding has evolved through Eleanor's journey reveals the complexity of historical causation and the dangers of simplified explanations for complex social phenomena. Her case initially appears to be about supernatural beliefs and religious persecution, but deeper examination reveals it was actually about gender roles, social control, economic pressures, and institutional dynamics that had little to do with anyone's beliefs about witchcraft. The supernatural accusations were symptoms of broader social tensions, rather than the fundamental cause of Eleanor's problems. Eleanor's story ultimately teaches us that preventing systematic injustice requires more than good intentions and proper procedures. It demands ongoing critical examination of institutional assumptions, systematic protection for individuals who challenge established norms, and recognition that the most dangerous forms of bias are often those that seem most reasonable to the people implementing them. Perhaps the most fitting conclusion to Eleanor's story comes from what happened to her in the final years of her life, long after the witchcraft accusations had faded into uncomfortable village memory. By the 1650s, Eleanor had evolved into something her community had never quite known how to categorize: a permanent resident who was simultaneously valued and avoided, consulted and feared, respected and isolated. Her cottage had become an unofficial destination for people facing problems that conventional wisdom couldn't solve. Young mothers would quietly visit when their children were sick and traditional remedies weren't working. Farmers would stop by when their crops were failing and they needed advice about soil conditions or pest control. Even the village authorities occasionally consulted her about practical matters, though these interactions were always informal and carefully kept out of official records. Eleanor had learned to navigate this strange social position with a combination of practical wisdom and careful diplomatic skills that she'd developed through years of experience with how easily her helpfulness could be misinterpreted. She offered advice when asked, but never volunteered suggestions that might seem like criticism of conventional methods. She shared her knowledge freely, but always framed it in ways that allowed people to feel like they were making their own decisions rather than following supernatural guidance. The irony was that Eleanor had become exactly what the village had always needed: a practical problem solver who could help people deal with the everyday challenges of rural life, but only after going through an experience that had taught her how dangerous it could be to seem too competent or too helpful. Her survival had required learning to hide her abilities behind a facade of normalcy that made her knowledge seem less threatening to people who might otherwise interpret it as evidence of supernatural powers. What this final chapter of Eleanor's life reveals about the broader themes of her story is how communities can eventually find ways to accommodate individuals who don't fit conventional social categories, but only after those individuals have learned to carefully manage their differences in ways that don't challenge established assumptions about social order. Eleanor's hard-won wisdom about how to be helpful without seeming threatening became a survival skill that allowed her to contribute to her community while avoiding the dangers that had nearly cost her life. Her relationship with her neighbors in these later years resembled a carefully negotiated truce, where everyone tacitly agreed to pretend that Eleanor was a normal village woman who just happened to be unusually good at solving practical problems. People continued to seek her advice, but they framed their requests in ways that avoided acknowledging that Eleanor possessed knowledge or abilities that exceeded normal expectations for women in her social position. The most poignant aspect of Eleanor's later life was how she had learned to appreciate the simple pleasure of being able to help people without having to worry about whether her helpfulness would be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activities. She could share her knowledge about herbal remedies, agricultural techniques, and practical problem solving without constantly monitoring how her advice might be perceived by people who were looking for signs of magical intervention. Eleanor's final years demonstrated both the resilience of human communities to eventually accommodate difference and the tragic cost of that accommodation process. She had found a way to live safely within a social system that had nearly destroyed her, but only by carefully limiting how much of her true capabilities she could express. Her story encapsulates the complex negotiations that many people throughout history have had to make between authentic self-expression and social survival, between helping others and protecting themselves, between competence and safety. In the end, Eleanor Blackthorne's story fades into the gentle obscurity that characterizes most human lives, regardless of how dramatic or significant they might seem to the people living them. She died peacefully in a cottage in 1661, surrounded by the herbs and books that had once been considered evidence of supernatural activities, but had long since become familiar parts of the village landscape. Her death was mourned quietly by the people who had learned to value her practical wisdom, celebrated discreetly by those who had benefited from her knowledge, and noted with relief by the few remaining villagers who had never quite stopped believing that she might have possessed dangerous powers. The official record simply notes the death of Eleanor Blackthorne, widow, with no mention of the extraordinary journey that had taken her from competent village woman to accused witch to cautious survivor. Eleanor's cottage was eventually inherited by a distant relative who had no knowledge of its complicated history. The spring that had motivated Sir Edmund Hartwell's intervention continued to flow, providing clean water for practical purposes that had nothing to do with the commercial schemes that had accidentally saved Eleanor's life. Her garden returned to the wild patterns that had once seemed so mysterious to her neighbors, but now simply looked like an overgrown plot that nobody had time to tend properly. The village itself continued its quiet existence, dealing with the same kinds of everyday problems that had always challenged rural communities: crop failures, animal diseases, social conflicts, and economic pressures that seemed to require explanations and solutions that were often beyond the reach of conventional wisdom. Occasionally, when faced with particularly difficult problems, older residents would remember Eleanor's practical advice and wonder whether anyone in the current generation possessed similar knowledge and skills. Perhaps most fittingly, Eleanor's story became part of the village's oral tradition, not as a cautionary tale about supernatural threats, but as a complicated narrative about a woman who had been misunderstood in ways that everyone preferred not to think about too carefully. The supernatural accusations were gradually forgotten or reinterpreted, but the memory of Eleanor's practical competence and tragic vulnerability lingered as a reminder of how easily communities can turn against the very people who are trying to help them. And so Eleanor's journey comes to its quiet conclusion, leaving behind questions about human nature, social justice, and the complex relationships between individual competence and community survival that remain as relevant today as they were in her own time. Her story invites us to reflect on how we interpret difference, how we respond to competence that challenges our assumptions, and how we can build institutions that protect rather than persecute the people who possess the knowledge and skills our communities actually need. Take a moment to appreciate the complexity of human societies, the persistence of psychological patterns across historical periods, and the importance of questioning our own assumptions about threats and safety, competence and danger, individual difference, and community welfare. Eleanor's story reminds us that the most important truths about human nature are often found not in dramatic events or obvious conflicts, but in the quiet daily interactions between people who are all trying their best to understand and help each other, even when they don't always succeed. Rest well, knowing that Eleanor's story, like all human stories, ultimately teaches us about our shared capacity for both wisdom and folly, kindness and fear, justice and error. A journey from competent woman to accused witch to cautious survivor reflects the endless human struggle to balance individual authenticity with social survival, personal knowledge with community acceptance, helpfulness with safety. In the gentle darkness of historical memory, Eleanor's experience becomes part of the larger human story about learning to live with difference, accommodate competence, and build communities that can protect rather than persecute the people who challenge us. To think more clearly about the problems we all face together. Sweet dreams. And remember that understanding the past helps us navigate the present with greater wisdom and compassion.